36-year-old Dexter Bain is finishing his shift at the Our Place pub.
Dexter loved his part-time job being a bartender. He had a lot of friends. He was happy to help out anyone.
Dexter agreed to close up tonight as a favor to the owner.
You guys gonna let me behind there, right?
If there was something wrong, he wanted to help you fix it. That's just the way he was. He had a very kind heart, probably to a fault.
I think I saw a different part of him than most people did because of the fact that I was lucky enough to have him as a dad. All of my memories have to do with him just being super goofy all the time, just because he knew that it would make me really happy. It really didn't matter who you were to him. He just wanted to make everybody feel important and cared for, and like Grandma said, kind of to a fault.
Police emergency? I've got a caller on the line here saying that somebody's been shot. All right, hi, sir.
We're in the front of the bar. He's lying on the ground in the front here shaking like... Are you breathing, Dexter? Okay, he's breathing, but he's really shocked. He's lying on the front of the sidewalk.
Okay.
But somebody came in the back of his bar with masks on and shot him.
There had been an altercation at a pub in the strip mall. Two gentlemen had run into a Mac store in a panic. A friend of theirs had been shot. The initial response by the Calgary Police Service was rapid. When the officers arrived at the scene, the victim was between the Mac store and the pub.
What happened?
He was just shot in the back of the bar. They just shot him.
He was being attended to by his friends. The victim was in serious, significant medical distress. His breathing was very shallow. He was losing blood internally at a very rapid pace and needed to get medical intervention.
Start at the beginning for me.
The patrons described that there was a commotion in the back behind the kitchen.
We heard a bang at the back door, and Dex went to go check it out.
There was an altercation. Dexter had come back towards the front of the bar, yelling, "Run."
Did you see anyone else in the bar?
There was a guy that came barging in afterwards. I didn't see his face or anything. He had a hood on.
So all that they could see was the eyes. The perpetrators then exit through the back door. Unfortunately, Dexter succumbed to those injuries pretty much by the time he arrived at the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Sadly, he had volunteered to keep the pub open that evening and then lost his life. Whoever came in there, he escalated it to murder. We can't have a person like that roaming the streets of Calgary. So you have a very short period of time to collect as much information as possible.
I need to secure the area, and I want you to extend the perimeter, okay?
As the primary investigator, my responsibility is to control the speed, flow, and direction of the investigation.
All right, let me know when you find something.
Okay, you bet.
The sun was just coming up when we started the videotaping. There were several objects lying on the ground outside on a snow-covered parking lot. One of them in particular was a pool cue. So was it used as a weapon? There was a large 2x4 piece of wood with a T on the end of it.
When police check with Dexter's friends, they explain the pool cue and the T-bar.
It turns out that when the patrons and Dexter went running out, they thought they were being attacked, so they grabbed things that they could hold as defensive weapons.
Once we completed the front examination, we went to the rear where the suspects had apparently entered the building. And we paid particular attention to footwear impressions. Anything in the snow that, again, might yield to the identity of an individual. The walkthrough of the inside of the bar yielded several footwear impressions on the linoleum floor near the service area,
which I hoped would place someone in particular at that scene. What we didn't find were shell casings.
In the inside of this particular bar, there was a surveillance camera.
So at that particular point, you can imagine I was very excited because the offender had approached the back of the bar and this camera should have captured the event.
Apparently you have a camera inside the bar. I'll need to get access to that.
The bar owner quickly told us that that was a red herring. It wasn't operational. It would have been a wonderful tool to use in this investigation, but sadly it was not available to us.
All right, thanks for your help anyway.
Detectives locate Dexter Bain's mother in New York.
November 27th, which was a Saturday, we were in Staten Island at my brother-in-law's house celebrating his 2-year-old grandson's birthday. I realized that I had some messages, and one of them was from the Calgary Police Department. Could I please call them? So immediately, as a mother, as a parent, your heart just kind of sinks. You think, oh my gosh, what's happened?
I have a message to call you. Yes, it's me.
So in talking to the detective on the phone, I think I finally said, just tell me, is my son dead? I was told that, yes, he had passed. Someone killed him. My husband walked up to me and obviously bawled my eyes out. I couldn't fathom one human being doing that to another for no reason. I had a lot of emotions going through me. There was hurt, there was pain, there was anger, a lot. He's missed. I miss him.
In Calgary, police asked neighbors if they saw anything around 3:30 a.m.
Through our neighborhood inquiries, we identified people who had seen something occur.
Hi, how are you?
Based on the witness information, there was a group, 2, possibly 3 people in that back alley, and there was a commotion at the back door. After a couple of loud bangs, they dispersed and ran. It wasn't a single person involved in this situation, but more than one. And I wanted to identify who those people were.
With no working cameras inside or outside the bar, police widen their search.
We had the strip mall itself. A lot of businesses are using cameras.
I need to get a look at your video footage from last night.
The Mac store, which is a small 24-hour convenience store in the same strip mall, had a series of surveillance cameras inside the store itself.
Send someone over to Max to pick up video footage.
Eyewitnesses during a stressful, chaotic circumstance are often a little bit mistaken. So when I found out that there was video at the Mac store, it gave me hope that we may have something tangible.
Great, thanks.
The footage is sent to the police department for analysis.
I had the 911 call to pinpoint the exact time.
It started at 3:15 a.m.
I started to look at who was in Max in that period of time. And I'm looking and I'm identifying people who could possibly be witnesses or perhaps even our shooter. It's the early morning. It's your typical purchase of a burrito or a hot coffee.
See if you can get a better angle.
People coming, people going, but based on the witness information, what we're looking for is a group.
Keep it playing. Who are they?
We started to look at a group of people who were in the Mac store 10 minutes prior to the event. I could see that there was a relationship. You know, some greeting, handshake. Probably looking at a group of 3 people in there, which fit with our description from our witnesses in the back alley who saw a group.
The men in the red and black hats are accompanied by a third man, who is all in black.
Who's that? Are there any other cameras?
One of the guys who's at the counter talking and paying for his item.
Zoom in on him.
Two, possibly 3 people in that video become persons of interest. And I wanted to identify who those people were.
Can you print that image?
In the case of a suspicious death, autopsies are held usually as soon after the incident as possible.
We found 2 entry points. They were small. There was a lack of an exit wound. Once the bullets went in and went down, it pierced his lungs. His lungs would have filled up with blood.
2 22-round bullets were seized from him by the pathologist during the autopsy. Potentially, firearms could do bullet comparisons to match those particular bullets back to a weapon.
Being able to link those bullets to a specific firearm were always going to be a challenge. But we had something to go on.
Detective Barrow sends screen grabs of the men in the Mac store to law enforcement citywide.
Detective out of 4 District immediately recognized 2 of the people involved.
You have any information on him?
He had been investigating a non-fatal shooting 4 weeks earlier where 22 caliber shell casings and a cell phone had been recovered. I immediately got intrigued.
I need you to send me everything you pulled from his phone.
I was able to get tech crimes to open up the cell phone and recover a number of videos depicting a rap music group.
Do you have any background on this rap group?
The rap group, it was a self-identified gang.
Police discover more rap videos online.
Whether they were an actual gang or an actual organized crime group, or if they were just a rap band, it's hard to say.
Yo, look, yo, here's the book, be in my school.
The online rap videos are compared to the Mac store video.
It was clear that they're the same people.
2 members of the group are identified as Kyle Ledesma and Harlan Obey.
Both Harlan Obey and Kyle Ledesma had a very distinct look, had a very distinct style. These were people of interest. What I wanted to do in this case was follow that evidence where it took us.
We flew out Monday night. We drove straight to Ashley's mom's house because I wanted to get to my granddaughter.
I remember immediately just going right into her arms.
I met you.
Obviously, we were crying, but I'll never forget. I think she said something along the lines of, "That bastard, how dare he do that to us?" And it was just enough to break the ice because, I mean, my dad was always putting us through the ringer. It didn't matter. Because he had that adventurous side, he was always doing something. She made that moment so much easier to breathe.
We clutched each other. We cried. If I could have taken her hurt away, I would have, you know?
The only information that we really got is that Dad was no longer here. Someone had murdered him. Just imagine being 16 and finding out this big piece of information. You're not just taking the life of the dead, but you're also taking the lives of the living. Instead of focusing on what he's missing, I focus on what we had. I mean, there's that firm belief that he's always there. I just really do take that with me in my day-to-day. That even though I can't see him, he can see me.
I went back and I started to really scrutinize the Mac Store video, looking for anything I had missed in the initial view. Kyle Ledesma is at the counter talking and paying for his item.
What do you have there?
Takes a glove off his right hand and he stuffs it inside his pocket. And what he does after that caught my attention.
Hey, come take a look at this. See that?
His right shoulder comes up. Almost like he's tucking something in his waistband. After carrying a firearm for most of my adult life, I recognized certain movements and certain traits. You know, when you're wearing a jacket and you have a firearm concealed on your hip, you're always, you check it. I saw this movement, and it was just enough to go, there it is. That's who's got the gun.
I think it's a gun.
Who's responsible for that firearm? Well, that was Kyle Ledesma. It's not something that I can take to court. I can't stand up and say, that is a gun, I need more. What else can I piece together to help me link Kyle Ledesma to that crime scene?
What about the shoes?
The shoe print that was collected from the scene that we believed was left there by our offender. It was a herringbone pattern that is fairly common.
Call all the stores in the local area.
We were able to canvass several shoe manufacturers in the area, and they were able to provide us with a list of potential shoes that might have made that impression.
Is that all of them? That's it.
And then I went back to the video and I started to scrutinize it again. All of a sudden, I recognize that one of them
Zoom in.
is wearing one of the shoes, and it's Kyle Ledesma. I've got the shoe, but again, it's speculation. I can't prove that that's the same shoe. What I really need to do is find Kyle.
Kyle Ledesma and his group lay low. Police don't know their location.
I was trying to find a starting point. Where was Kyle? Where was his crew? Who else was in his crew? How can I link into him?
Nothing at all. Okay.
So you have a plan in your head what you want to implement once you find him. But it all hinges on finding him. As the months started to pass, there's still a lot of investigative work going on in the background. We still haven't been able to find Kyle, and it becomes frustrating. And then we finally got our break.
They just brought him in.
Police responded to deal with Kyle Ledesma's cousin, who had been shot. Kyle and his group were asked to come to 4th District office to provide statements.
Kyle Ledesma denies any involvement in the shooting.
Kyle Ledesma's cousin was taken to the hospital where a .22 caliber bullet was removed from him. Fortunately, that young man survived. There was consideration of arresting him and talking to him about the murder of Dexter Bain.
You want to speak to him?
No, not yet.
I knew I didn't have enough evidence, and I didn't want to tip my hand or jeopardize the investigation at that particular moment.
Kyle Ledesma is allowed to walk, while police continue to build their case.
Later that same evening, a passerby actually found a firearm in the field immediately adjacent to where Kyle Ledesma was picked up. We feel that it was tossed by Kyle during the incident.
The gun, a .22 Ruger pistol, is handed in to police. The Ruger is sent for DNA and ballistics testing.
A search warrant was authorized for the search of Kyle Ledesma's house in relation to the shooting of Kyle's cousin. The evidence that was collected included a whole pocket full of mishmash .22 caliber long rifle ammunition. A pattern started to emerge regarding the .22 caliber firearm.
A .22 is the same caliber used in Dexter Bain's murder.
Everything is starting to make sense and be pieced together. Now, it's still circumstantial, and I'm still looking for the smoking gun, and I don't have it.
10 months on from the killing of Dexter Bain, his family still waits for answers.
I had to accept the fact that my son was gone. He's gone. He's gone forever. And that forever part just, I think that's what hits you like a ton of bricks. It's the forever. Ashley was always full of questions, and I gave her the answers that I had.
We didn't know who did it. We don't know why he did it. Obviously, they couldn't share all of these details. Just not knowing it can be incredibly frustrating, and it just makes that grieving process a lot more difficult.
At the lab, the recovered .22 pistol is being tested.
Typically, you'll find DNA on the exterior surface. You would swab the entire gun with several different swabs, and then those swabs, along with the gun, are sent off to the lab for further analysis. Ledesma's DNA ultimately was found on that handgun.
Now, to see if the bullets from the murder match Ledesma's .22.
The smaller the caliber, the more difficult it is to make a positive identification. And the smaller the bullet, the more distortion that can be caused with it when it strikes a bone or another object. In this particular case, there wasn't enough unique evidence on the .22 rounds seized at the autopsy to match it back to that particular handgun.
I've got DNA, which is linking that gun to my suspect, but everything else is kind of circumstantial. There's no motivation for Kyle Ledesma to speak to the police, so it's very difficult to get a confession at the end of it. But I have a starting point. Now I have the opportunity to get creative.
To catch Ledesma acknowledging his crime outside the interview room, police plan an audacious sting operation. They establish a fictitious organized crime group led by a fake boss, nicknamed Mr. Big.
We creatively looked for ways in order to introduce ourselves to Kyle Ledesma, to gain his confidence. Kyle Ledesma was motivated by money.
You have to stay on this, day and night, okay? We need to build his trust. Let's go, thank you.
Eventually, our undercover operator was introduced to him and provided an opportunity for him to work.
This is Operation Marauder, Scenario 34, working with T1 Kyle Ledesma. Carry out the scenario objectives.
Undercover officers pose as low-level gang members to gain his trust.
Listening in on what he was doing was nerve-wracking. You know, at any given moment, the wheels could have fallen off this.
Can I do anything for you, man? Anything? Like, I talked to not my decision, but I know he's got work out of town.
And it really didn't take long before we had him doing projects that he perceived were criminal on behalf of our undercover operators. Once we had the confidence of Kyle, I started to work on what we call stims. It's a stimulation for him to begin conversation where he would be willing to speak about his crime.
It's time to pull in the net.
To mark the one-year anniversary of the crime,
would you mind taking a look at some pictures for me?
Police release images from the Mac store video, appealing for information.
We already knew who they were, but we wanted to get conversations started. Officers started knocking on doors and having people like Obey and his friends and family members calling him constantly, "Hey, the police were here, they're looking for you, you're wanted for murder."
Kyle Ledesma is recorded talking to Harlan Obey, one of the men seen with him in the rap videos and Mac store surveillance.
Yeah, that told me that they came there again, man. You shave your face, man, just in case, man.
I came by the crib twice already, man.
Yeah, I know, exactly. So, man, use your brain, man. Shave guy.
He's talking about Obey cutting his hair off so he doesn't look like the image in the Mac store anymore.
Yeah, but even if I did, they're gonna look at me and they're gonna be like, "Yo, why did you shave?"
So you're gonna rat everybody out there?
No, but like at the same time, man, like, you know, like.
Dog, they're gonna come there and they're gonna show you the exact same picture of what you look like right now. Use your head, man.
I can only imagine how a young criminal, how his mind must have been spinning out of control. At the end of it, I guess he needed help. He needed to talk to somebody. And that's when we started to close the net in on him.
As pressure mounts, Ledesma is invited to Vancouver by the fake crime group to discuss an offer of protection from Mr. Big.
You got that conversation going, and here we go. And you start the snowball down the hill, and it's just gathering. And all we need to do now is get that confession with our Mr. Big scenario. We set up our meeting with Mr. Big, and you know when they're heading there that this is it. This is going to be our smoking gun.
An undercover officer posing as Mr. Big hopes to get Ledesma to admit to killing Dexter Bain.
I was located in a covert vehicle. We're watching it in real time. We had built a good mousetrap, but there's always that possibility that it goes off the rails.
He's here.
Ledesma arrives with his main contact, another undercover cop.
the apartment. It's a place where people would feel comfortable.
Good. There's okay. There's some food in the fridge there.
Our boss is kicked back in a big easy chair in a circumstance that would put anybody at ease.
What's going on?
Well, just know that the case had some demons come up. So I was thinking that, maybe some, hooking them up with some IDs.
And there's kind of relief in his body language that he's there, but you can see the cocky, arrogant kid. Now he's on his heels.
Obviously, I'm not going to go out on a limb here and make promises. I don't know what I'm getting myself into, right?
Yeah, no, that's what I said.
As we started to encourage Kyle to start talking about what's going on, what's happening.
So what's come up? What's going on, man?
I put in some work last year, man. I got word today from my buddy that my house got raided. This cop's looking for me, saying that they want to charge me for murder.
He starts to talk about what's happening back in Calgary and how they're looking for him for murder.
They want to charge you for murder, or they are going to charge you for murder?
Hey, let's put it this way, they have the gun.
You're sitting there waiting and watching and knowing that at any given moment something could happen and we're not going to get that nugget that we've been waiting for and planning for.
You've been a good soldier that I've noticed. And said nothing but good things about you, man. Right? So, it ain't cheap to get papers. But if that's what it takes, then we can go down that road. But, if I'm gonna kind of throw myself into this one too, because, you've seen a little bit of what happens here.
Yes, sir.
I need to know a little bit more, paint me a better picture of what's going on.
And then he starts to describe the incident itself.
It's like moving around this movement, went sour. Dude got shot a couple times, he died. They have no beating spins, nothing like that. They have us in the store around the situation, around the time it happened, right?
You know the guy's name or anything like that would be in the news article?
Very naturally, our undercover boss asks some pretty simple question like, who is this guy?
Dexter something. Dexter Bain.
Starting to create that evidence chain. Here's who we're talking about. We're not talking about anybody random. We're talking about Dexter Bain.
Did you know the dude?
Me or my buddy, we didn't know him.
Nothing to tell you to him, sort of thing, eh?
Not at all.
Sorry, did he see you guys coming? What I mean, like...
No, we banged on the door and just said that we're cops. We opened the door.
The front door of the place?
That door.
Through an alley?
Yeah.
He's describing this incident, this altercation at the back door.
And then he cracked the door and then he went down.
Like, did he put up a scrap?
Yeah, he put up a scrap. He caught a couple of them.
I'm getting excited. Things are leaking out in conversation about this crime. Nobody else knows. The conversation, it's there. It's right there. You could taste it. This whole project has been funneled down into this moment. And here we go.
Who was them?
You're on pins and needles, just waiting for him to say it. Come on.
Who was them?
He's got his hands between his knees, and he kind of droops his head, and you can see it in his body language that he's got to let them in on what he has done. You realize, aha, I've got it. It was such a relief We've built the mouse trap, and the trap's been sprung, and he's admitted it's him. And then he's right back because there's a few more pieces that certainly needed to be corroborated and gathered. And we were able to communicate with the undercover operator if we needed to.
When you trap him, was he bleeding at all?
Just doesn't add up. Even thinking when he died, man, he got hit so low. Basically, it was like right here, man. So basically, he has to. But, you know, those things bounce like a probably hit one of his bones and just went right up to the system.
He provides the specific details where Dexter was shot in his back. Kyle provided that admission and those markers of reliability that are woven through his story.
Middle of the night. Chill out, grab a bottle. Relax. I mean, rock as much as you can, right?
Yeah. They have to prove it, so.
Exactly, man.
How are you going to do that?
Yeah.
They have nothing.
Yeah.
Right. Let's get the paperwork straight, and then we'll bring him in.
Kyle Ledesma is arrested and brought to the Calgary Police Department. He declines to say anything. But Ledesma's appearance in the Mac store before the crime and his statements to Mr. Big
Who bought them?
Me, man.
are damning. Kyle Ledesma is convicted of the second-degree murder of Dexter Bain and given life. In the shooting of Ledesma's cousin, all charges are dropped. In Dexter's murder, due to a lack of evidence, neither Harlan Obey nor anyone else in the Mac store video is charged with any wrongdoing.
This was a random act of violence against a person that's the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's tragic. Dexter Bain's family, they wanted justice, they wanted to find the truth, and they wanted somebody to be held responsible. And I guess at the end of the day, that's what kept me going, and that's what's brought me here today.
I miss his laugh. And I miss his texts. And when I see him, I miss his big hugs and picking me up. You never get over the loss of a child. You just don't. And there's always that hole in your heart, but you learn that life goes on. I loved him so much, but it has to go on.
He was someone who just loved to have fun and live life the way that he wanted to live it. And he really, truly did want everybody to feel special. He was just kind of everybody's friend. And he would do anything for anybody. Every big event that comes, whether it be a wedding, graduating, having kids down the road, all those big moments that, you know, he should be there. And he's not going to be.
He was shot?
There's a large amount of blood.
The family has been ripped apart.
This dark figure, we gotta find out who he is.
What we learned, it's a tragedy.
The car had been moving for some time before anyone realized something was wrong. It cut through the quiet roads of Honolulu under a sky that offered no witnesses. Only darkness pressed low against the island. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with something unspoken, something final. There were voices at first, low and controlled, then sharper, demanding, insisting. A question repeated itself, again and again, like a ritual. A name, a confession, a truth that refused to arrive. In the back seat, a man sat restrained, his body held in place not only by rope, but by the weight of expectation. Joseph Kahahawai had no courtroom here, no judge, no jury. There would be no deliberation, no measured weighing of evidence. Only the narrow confines of a moving vehicle and the certainty that whatever decision was being made had already been decided long before he was pulled inside. The voices pressed him. They needed something from him, something specific, something that would justify everything that had already been set into motion. But he did not give it to them. He could not, or he would not. In that moment, the distinction no longer mattered. And then the tension broke. A single gunshot does not last long. It is a brief, violent interruption, a sound that fractures the air and disappears almost as quickly as it arrives. But what it leaves behind lingers. In that car, in that moment, it marked the end of one life and the beginning of something far more complicated, something that would ripple far beyond the island itself. When the body of Joseph Kahahawai was later found, it told a story that could not be ignored.
Bound.
Shot at close range. Not the victim of a random act, not the casualty of some unseen danger lurking in the night, but the result of a deliberate decision. Someone had chosen this. Someone had believed they had the right. The question was not simply who had pulled the trigger. That, in time, would become clear. The deeper question, the one that would refuse to settle, was why. Why did a group of people believe they could take a man, question him, and end his life outside the boundaries of the law? Why did they believe that whatever had happened before justified what came next? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why would so many others come to see their actions not as a crime, but as something understandable, even necessary? To answer those questions, you have to go back to where it began. Not in that car, not on that road, but weeks earlier, on a night that would fracture the fragile balance of a place already divided against itself. It began with a claim. On September 12, 1931, a woman named Talia Massey said that something had been done to her. She had been out that night, part of a world defined by rank and status, by uniforms and expectations, by the quiet assurance that some people were meant to be protected while others were expected to stay in their place. When she was found, she was not the same woman who had left earlier that evening. She was shaken. Her clothing was torn. There were signs of a struggle, of something violent, something that had left its mark not only on her body, but on the narrative that would follow. She said she had been attacked, not by one person, but by a group. Men she could not clearly identify, but men she believed belonged to a specific community, a specific part of the island's population. The details mattered, but they were never entirely stable. The timeline shifted. The locations seemed uncertain. The descriptions lacked precision. There were gaps, inconsistencies that might have raised questions under different circumstances. But these were not ordinary circumstances. Because of who she was, and because of who her husband was, the claim did not exist in isolation. It moved quickly, carried by networks of influence that ensured it would not be ignored. The military took notice. The press took notice. And soon, the entire island was watching. In a place like Hawaii in the early 1930s, a story like this did not remain just a story. It became something else. A symbol, a fault line, a reflection of tensions that had been building for years, perhaps decades. There were already divisions between those who held power and those who did not. Between those who saw themselves as protectors of order and those who lived within that order without ever shaping it. The accusation made by Talia Massey did not create those divisions, but it illuminated them in a way that made them impossible to ignore. The response was immediate. There was pressure, not subtle, not patient, but urgent and insistent. Something had to be done. Someone had to be held responsible. The idea that uncertainty might require time, that doubt might require caution, was overshadowed by the demand for action. And so the search began. Names were gathered. Suspects identified. Among them was Joseph Kahahawai, a man who would soon find himself at the center of a case that had already taken on a life of its own. He was not alone. Others were brought in, questioned, placed within a narrative that was still forming even as it moved forward. But the foundation of that narrative was fragile. there was no strong physical evidence tying them to the alleged crime. The identification was uncertain. The story, while compelling, was not consistent. And yet, the momentum continued, driven not by certainty, but by expectation. It is often said that justice requires patience, that it depends on the careful assembly of facts, on the willingness to accept what can be proven rather than what is simply believed. But in this case, patience was in short supply. The case moved toward trial, carrying with it all the weight of public attention and private conviction. It was no longer just about what had happened on a single night. It was about what people believed had happened and what they believed needed to be done in response. And when the trial began, those beliefs collided. The courtroom became a space where more than evidence was being considered. There were divisions that ran deeper than the case itself. Lines drawn not only by testimony, but by identity, by allegiance, by the unspoken assumptions that each person carried with them. The jury could not agree. After days of argument, of presentation, of attempts to impose clarity on a situation that resisted it, the process reached an impasse. There was no verdict, no resolution, only a recognition that whatever truth lay at the center of the case, it had not been established in a way that everyone could accept. For some, that was where the story should have paused, where the system, imperfect as it might be, had done what it was designed to do. It had withheld judgment in the absence of certainty. But for others, it was not enough. Because if the system could not deliver a conclusion, then perhaps the conclusion would have to be delivered another way. That is how you arrive back at the car. Back at the moment when uncertainty is no longer tolerated, when doubt is no longer permitted, when the need for an answer overrides the need for proof. The abduction of Joseph Kahahawai was not a random act. It was a continuation, an escalation, a decision to move beyond the boundaries that had previously contained the situation. Inside that vehicle, the question was no longer what could be proven. It was what could be forced. But even then, even under pressure, even in a situation where the outcome seemed increasingly inevitable, the answer they wanted did not come. And so, the shot was fired. It is easy, in hindsight, to reduce a moment like that to a simple act of violence. But it was more than that. It was a statement. A declaration that, in that moment, the people in that car believed they understood the truth well enough to act on it, even in the absence of a legal confirmation. The aftermath would challenge that belief. Because once the body was found, once the details became known, the situation could no longer be contained within a single narrative. It expanded, pulling in new questions, new perspectives, new conflicts. The focus shifted, not away from the original accusation, but toward what had been done in its name. Who was the victim now? Was it the woman who had made the claim, whose experience remained unresolved, whose story had never been conclusively proven or disproven? Or was it the man who had been taken, restrained, and killed without a trial, without a verdict, without a chance to defend himself in the way the system required? The answer depended on who you asked. And that is what made this case different. It was not just about what happened. It was about how people chose to interpret what happened and what those interpretations revealed about the world they were living in. Because in the end, the most unsettling aspect of this story is not the violence itself. It is the way that violence was understood, justified, and in some cases defended. The car, the shot, the body left behind, those are the elements that draw attention. They are immediate, undeniable, but they are only the surface. Beneath them lies something more complex. A story about power, about belief, about the fragile line between justice and vengeance, and how easily that line can disappear when people are convinced they are right. And as this case unfolds, that line will be tested again and again until it becomes almost impossible to see where it was supposed to be in the first place. To understand what happened in the weeks that followed, it is necessary to step back from the immediacy of the crime and look at the world in which it unfolded. Because this was not a case that existed in isolation. It was shaped, influenced, and ultimately defined by the environment surrounding it. And that environment was not neutral. In the early 1930s, Hawaii was a place of layered identities and unequal power. It was not yet a state in the modern sense, but a territory under the control of the United States, where military presence was not just visible, but deeply embedded in daily life. Ships arrived and departed with quiet regularity, uniforms were a common sight, and authority often carried the unmistakable imprint of the mainland. Within this structure, society was not evenly distributed. There were clear distinctions, some formal, others unspoken but no less powerful. At the top were those connected to the military and the American elite, individuals who carried with them a sense of entitlement reinforced by both rank and background. Beneath them were the local populations, including native Hawaiians and immigrant communities from Asia, who lived within the same geographic space, but did not share the same level of influence. These divisions were not always visible in overt conflict, but they were present in the way people interacted, in the assumptions they made, and in the expectations they held about one another. Trust did not flow freely across these boundaries. It was cautious, conditional, and often absent. Into this environment stepped Talia Massey, a woman whose identity placed her firmly within the upper tier of this social hierarchy. She was the wife of a United States Navy officer, a position that carried not only prestige but also protection. Her life was connected to the structures of authority that defined the territory, and her voice, when raised, would not go unheard. Yet to reduce her to a symbol of privilege would be to overlook the complexity of her position. On the night of September 12, 1931, she became something else as well. She became a complainant, a person who claimed to have been harmed, who said that something violent had been done to her. Whatever uncertainties would later surround her account, in that moment she was at the center of a narrative that demanded attention. Her condition when she was found added urgency to that narrative. She was distressed, disoriented, and visibly affected. Her clothing showed signs of damage, and there were indications that she had been involved in a struggle. These details were not abstract. They were immediate, tangible, and they contributed to the perception that something serious had occurred. But even as her account gained traction, questions began to emerge. Not necessarily from those in positions of authority who were under pressure to act, but from the inconsistencies within the story itself. The details did not align perfectly. The timeline shifted. The location was not fixed. The description of the alleged attackers lacked clarity. Under different circumstances, these inconsistencies might have slowed the process, introduced caution, or prompted a more measured approach. But the context in which this case existed did not allow for that kind of restraint. The expectations placed on the authorities were too strong, the demand for resolution too immediate. And so, the focus shifted toward identifying those who could be held responsible. This is where Joseph Kahahawai enters the story, not as a proven perpetrator, but as a suspect within a rapidly developing narrative. He was one of several men who were arrested in connection with the accusation. His identity as a native Hawaiian and a public figure in the local boxing scene placed him in a position that was both visible and vulnerable. To understand his role in this story, it is important to recognize that at this stage he had not been convicted of anything. He was a person accused, not a person proven guilty. And yet, the distinction between those two states was not always respected in the way the case was discussed or perceived. The arrest of Kahahawai and the others was not based on overwhelming physical evidence. There was no definitive forensic link tying them to the alleged crime. Instead, the case relied heavily on the statements made by Talia Massey, statements that, as previously noted, contained inconsistencies. This reliance on testimony over physical proof is not unusual in cases of this nature, but it does introduce a level of uncertainty. It requires the legal system to evaluate credibility, to weigh the reliability of memory and perception, and to make decisions based on information that is not always complete. In this case, those decisions were made under significant pressure. The presence of the military, the involvement of influential individuals, and the attention of the press all contributed to an environment in which the stakes were elevated. This was not simply a matter of determining what had happened. It was a matter of responding in a way that would satisfy expectations, maintain order, and reinforce the existing structure of authority. At the same time, the case was being observed from another perspective, one that was shaped by the experiences of the local population. For many Native Hawaiians and members of other marginalized communities, the arrests did not necessarily represent justice. Instead, they raised concerns about fairness, about whether the process was being conducted impartially, or whether it was influenced by the identities of those involved. These competing perspectives did not cancel each other out. They existed simultaneously, creating a tension that would become more pronounced as the case moved forward. The courtroom, when the trial began, would become the place where these tensions were most visible. But even before that, they were present in the way the case was discussed, in the assumptions that were made, and in the expectations that surrounded it. For the family of Talia Massey, the situation was not simply a legal matter. It was personal. It involved questions of harm, of accountability, and of what they believed needed to happen in order to address what had been done. At the center of that response was Grace Fortescue, the mother of Talia. Her position, like that of her daughter, was defined by status and influence. She was not someone accustomed to having her concerns dismissed or delayed. When confronted with a situation that she believed demanded action, she expected that action to be taken. Her perspective was reinforced by those around her, including Thomas Massey, her son-in-law. Together, they represented a network of relationships and authority that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of the case. But influence does not guarantee satisfaction. When the legal process began to unfold, it did not produce the clarity or resolution that they had anticipated. Instead, it revealed the complexity of the situation. The evidence was not definitive. The testimony was not consistent. The jury, when faced with the task of reaching a decision, found itself divided. This division was not simply a matter of differing interpretations of the facts. It reflected deeper differences in perspective, in belief, and in the way the case was understood. Some saw the accusation as credible and compelling, deserving of a strong response. Others saw the lack of concrete evidence as a reason for caution, a reason to withhold judgment until more could be established. When the jury ultimately failed to reach a unanimous verdict, the result was not closure. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty, in this context, was not easily accepted. For those who believed that the case had already been decided in principle, the absence of a formal conviction did not change their view. It did not diminish their sense of what had happened or what needed to be done. Instead, it created a gap between their expectations and the outcome produced by the legal system. That gap would prove to be significant, because it introduced a question that would shape everything that followed. What happens when the system designed to deliver justice does not produce the result that some believe is correct? For some, the answer is to accept the outcome, to acknowledge the limitations of the process, and to move forward within the boundaries that have been established. For others, the answer is different. It involves stepping outside those boundaries, taking action independently, and redefining what justice means in a way that aligns with their own beliefs. In the case of the Massey family, that second path would become the one they chose. But at this point in the story, that choice had not yet been fully realized. It existed as a possibility, shaped by frustration, by conviction, and by a sense that something essential had been left unresolved. The stage had been set. The key figures were in place. The tensions, both social and personal, had been brought to the surface. What remained was the moment when those elements would converge, when belief would override restraint, and when the consequences of that decision would begin to unfold. And when that moment came, it would not only change the course of this case, it would redefine it entirely. On the night of September 12, 1931, the sequence of events that would later fracture a community began in a way that did not immediately suggest the magnitude of what was to come. It was an ordinary social evening, structured by the expectations and routines of a world shaped by hierarchy and order. People gathered, spoke, and moved through spaces where familiarity and status defined their interactions. Among them was Talia Massey, whose presence carried the quiet authority of her position within that society. At some point during the evening, she left the gathering. The exact moment, like many details that would later become central to the case, was not fixed with precision. What is known is that there existed a period of time after her departure that could not be clearly accounted for. It was a gap, a stretch of uncertainty that would become the foundation upon which the rest of the narrative was built. When she was next seen, the situation had changed. She was no longer composed in the way she had been earlier that evening. Instead, she appeared distressed, her demeanor marked by agitation and fear. Her clothing showed signs of damage, and there were visible indications that something physical had occurred. The shift was immediate and difficult to ignore. It did not require interpretation to understand that she believed she had been harmed. Her account followed quickly. She said that she had been attacked by a group of men. Not a single individual, not an isolated confrontation, but something more coordinated, more overwhelming. According to her statement, the men were of native Hawaiian background. This detail would prove to be as significant as any other, not because it clarified what had happened, but because of how it intersected with the existing tensions within Hawaii at the time. The reaction to her claim was immediate. It moved rapidly through the channels of authority, drawing attention from both the military and local law enforcement. This was not treated as an incident that could be examined slowly or cautiously. It was approached with urgency, with the understanding that a response was required and that it needed to be visible. At first, the focus remained on her account itself. Investigators sought to establish what had happened, where it had occurred, and who might have been involved. But as they began to examine the details, inconsistencies became apparent. The timeline she provided did not remain constant. The location shifted depending on how it was described. The identities of the alleged attackers were not clearly defined. These inconsistencies did not necessarily mean that the event had not occurred. Memory, particularly under stress, is not always precise. Trauma can affect perception, distort sequences, and complicate recall. But in a legal context, these factors introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty requires careful handling. In this case, however, the presence of uncertainty did not slow the process. Instead, it coexisted with a growing sense of pressure. The expectation that something had to be done did not diminish in the face of incomplete information. If anything, it intensified. The lack of clarity created a vacuum, and that vacuum was quickly filled by assumption, by inference, and by the desire to reach a conclusion. As the investigation continued, attention turned toward identifying individuals who could be connected to the accusation. The criteria for that connection were not based on definitive evidence, but on a combination of circumstance, perception, and the need to move forward. It was within this context that several men were identified and brought into custody. Among them was Joseph Kahawai. His inclusion in the group of suspects was not the result of a single piece of conclusive evidence, but rather part of a broader effort to align the available information with a set of individuals. The arrests marked a transition in the case. What had begun as an allegation now moved toward formal proceedings. The narrative, still incomplete, began to take on a more structured form. There were now named suspects, a defined accusation, and an expectation that the legal system would provide an answer. But even as the case advanced, the underlying issues remained unresolved. The lack of strong physical evidence continued to be a factor. There was no clear forensic link tying the suspects to the alleged crime. The identification process was uncertain, shaped by the limitations of the information provided. And yet, the movement toward trial continued. This progression was not driven solely by the facts of the case. It was influenced by the environment in which the case existed, by the expectations placed on the authorities, and by the broader social context that framed the accusation. As the suspects awaited trial, the case began to take on a life beyond the courtroom. It was discussed, debated, and interpreted in ways that reflected the divisions within the community. For some, the arrests represented a necessary step toward justice. For others, they raised concerns about fairness, about whether the process was being conducted in a way that respected the rights of those involved. These differing perspectives did not resolve themselves. Instead, they became more pronounced as the case moved closer to trial. When the proceedings finally began, they carried with them all of the complexity that had developed in the weeks leading up to that moment. The courtroom was not just a place where evidence would be presented. It was a space where competing narratives would be tested, where the assumptions and beliefs that had formed outside its walls would be brought into direct confrontation. At the center of those proceedings was the account provided by Talia Massey. Her testimony was a critical component of the case, shaping the way the events of that night were understood. But it was also subject to scrutiny, to questions about consistency, about detail, and about reliability. The defense, in turn, focused on the absence of concrete evidence, on the gaps within the narrative, and on the principle that accusation alone was not sufficient to establish guilt. This dynamic created a tension that was difficult to resolve because it was rooted not only in the facts of the case, but in the way those facts were interpreted. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the jury was not unified in its assessment. The division was not simply a matter of differing opinions about the evidence. It reflected deeper differences in perspective, shaped by the social context in which the case existed. The question of what had happened on the night of September 12th could not be separated from the broader questions of trust, authority, and fairness that surrounded it. When the jury ultimately failed to reach a verdict, the result was not a conclusion, but a continuation of uncertainty. For some, this outcome was a reflection of the complexity of the case, an acknowledgement that the available evidence was not sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For others, it was a failure, an indication that the system had not delivered the justice they believed was warranted. It is at this point that the narrative begins to shift. Up to this moment, the events had unfolded within the boundaries of the legal system. There had been an accusation, an investigation, arrests, and a trial. The process, while imperfect, had followed a recognizable structure. But the absence of a verdict created a break in that structure. It introduced a sense of incompleteness, a feeling that something essential had been left unresolved. And for those who believed that they already understood the truth of the situation, that incompleteness was not acceptable. The idea that the matter could remain unsettled, that no definitive judgment would be rendered, was not something they were willing to accept. And so, the focus began to shift away from what had happened on the night of September 12th toward what would happen next. The incident itself, with all its uncertainty and complexity, had set the stage. It had created the conditions under which the following actions would take place. It had defined the roles, established the tensions, and introduced the questions that would drive the rest of the story. But it had not provided answers. Those answers, or at least the attempt to impose them, would come later, in a way that would move beyond the boundaries of the courtroom and into a space where the distinction between justice and vengeance would become increasingly difficult to define. And when that moment arrived, it would not simply resolve the questions raised by the incident. It would transform them, adding new layers of complexity, new consequences, and a new set of questions that would prove even more difficult to answer. The investigation did not begin with clarity. It began with urgency. From the moment Talia Massey made her accusation, the expectation was not simply that the truth would be found, but that it would be found quickly. In an environment already shaped by imbalance and tension, delay was interpreted as weakness and uncertainty as failure. The authorities moved forward not with a complete picture, but with a demand to construct one. The first stage of the investigation centered on gathering accounts, assembling fragments of information into something that could resemble a coherent narrative. Yet even at this early point, there were complications. The details provided by Massey did not remain entirely stable. Elements of time and place shifted in ways that made it difficult to anchor the event to a single, verifiable sequence. These inconsistencies did not halt the investigation, but they introduced a level of ambiguity that would persist throughout the case. Despite this, the process moved toward identifying suspects. The logic was not built on definitive proof, but on association and interpretation. A group of men was selected, questioned, and ultimately detained. Among them was Joseph Kahahawai, whose presence within the case would become central not because of evidence that conclusively linked him to the alleged crime, but because he became part of the structure that the investigation was forming. The arrests gave the appearance of progress. They signaled that the system was responding, that it was acting in accordance with the expectations placed upon it. But beneath that appearance, the underlying issues remained unresolved. The evidence was still limited. There was no strong physical connection between the suspects and the accusation. The case relied heavily on testimony, and that testimony contained gaps. As the investigation transitioned into formal legal proceedings, these weaknesses did not disappear. They were carried into the courtroom, where they would be examined, challenged, and interpreted in different ways. The trial became the focal point of the case, not only because it was the mechanism through which a verdict would be reached, but because it was where the broader tensions surrounding the case became visible. The courtroom was not isolated from the social environment outside it. It reflected that environment, incorporating its divisions and amplifying them. On one side was the account provided by Talia Massey, a narrative that described a violent assault carried out by multiple individuals. Her testimony was presented as the central piece of evidence, the foundation upon which the case rested. It was detailed but not entirely consistent. Under scrutiny, the variations in her account became more apparent, raising questions about reliability without providing definitive answers. On the other side was the defense, which focused on the absence of corroborating evidence. They emphasized that no physical proof directly linked the accused men to the alleged crime. They highlighted the inconsistencies in the testimony and argued that these inconsistencies undermined the strength of the case. Their position was not that an event had definitively not occurred, but that the available evidence was insufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This dynamic created a tension that was not easily resolved. The jury was tasked with evaluating not only the facts presented, but the credibility of those facts, the weight they should be given, and the extent to which they could be relied upon. It was a process that required consensus, but consensus proved difficult to achieve. The division within the jury reflected the broader divisions within the community. It was not simply a matter of interpreting evidence differently. It was a matter of approaching the case from fundamentally different perspectives, shaped by background, experience, and belief. Some jurors viewed the testimony as compelling enough to warrant conviction. Others saw the lack of physical evidence and the inconsistencies as reasons for doubt. These positions did not converge. They remained separate, resistant to compromise. After extended deliberation, the outcome was not a verdict, but a stalemate. The jury could not reach a unanimous decision. The case, as it had been presented, did not produce the clarity required for a legal conclusion. This result, known as a hung jury, represented a pause in the process. It indicated that the system had not been able to resolve the case based on the available information. In principle, it allowed for the possibility of a retrial, a continuation of the effort to establish the truth through legal means. But in practice, it created a sense of dissatisfaction. For those who believed that the case had already been decided in substance, the absence of a formal verdict was not acceptable. It was seen not as a reflection of the complexity of the evidence, but as a failure of the system to deliver justice. This perception did not emerge in isolation. It was reinforced by the broader context in which the case existed, by the expectations placed on the legal process, and by the belief that certain outcomes were necessary. At the center of this response was Grace Fortescue, whose reaction to the hung jury would become a turning point in the case. For her, the lack of a verdict did not represent uncertainty. It represented an injustice that required correction. The idea that the accused men might remain unpunished was not something she was willing to accept. Her perspective was shared and supported by Thomas Massey, whose connection to both the alleged victim and the structures of authority added weight to that position. Together, they formed a response that moved beyond the boundaries of the legal system. The decision that followed was not impulsive in the sense of being unconsidered, but it was decisive in the sense that it rejected the constraints of the process that had just concluded. If the courtroom could not produce a result, then the result would have to be produced elsewhere. This shift marked a fundamental change in the nature of the case. Up to this point, the investigation had operated within a defined framework. There had been procedures, rules, and expectations that governed how the case was handled. The transition from investigation to trial had followed a recognizable path. The actions that followed would not. In January 1932, Joseph Kahahawai was taken into custody again, not by law enforcement acting within their official capacity, but by individuals who had decided to take matters into their own hands. The act of taking him was deliberate. It was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a conscious decision to remove him from the protection of the legal system and place him in a situation where different rules would apply. He was placed in a car, restrained, and subjected to questioning. The purpose of this questioning was not to gather information in the way that a formal investigation would, but to obtain a specific outcome: a confession. An admission that would confirm what those conducting the interrogation already believed to be true. The environment inside the car was fundamentally different from the courtroom. There were no safeguards, no procedures designed to ensure fairness or accuracy. There was only the imbalance of power between those asking the questions and the person being questioned. Kahahawai denied the accusation. He did not provide the confession that was being demanded. Whether his denial reflected innocence, resistance, or some other factor, the effect was the same. It created a conflict between expectation and reality. That conflict escalated. The situation moved beyond questioning into violence. The boundary that separates coercion from force was crossed, and once crossed, it did not return. The pressure to produce a result did not diminish. It intensified. And then, in a moment that would redefine the case entirely, a shot was fired. The killing of Joseph Kahahawai was not an unintended consequence. It was the culmination of a process that had been building from the moment the original accusation was made. Each step, from the inconsistencies in the testimony to the failure of the jury to reach a verdict, had contributed to an environment in which this outcome became possible. When his body was later discovered, it provided evidence of what had occurred. He had been restrained. He had been shot at close range. The circumstances of his death were clear in a way that the circumstances of the original accusation had not been. This clarity shifted the focus of the case. The investigation that had once centered on determining whether a crime had been committed against Talia Massey now expanded to include a second, undeniable act of violence. This act did not rely on inconsistent testimony or uncertain identification. It was supported by physical evidence, by the condition of the body, and by the circumstances in which it was found. The individuals responsible for this act would soon be identified and brought into custody. But the implications of what had happened extended beyond the identification of those involved. Because the case was no longer just about what had happened on the night of September 12th. It was about what had happened in response to that night. It was about the decision to bypass the legal system, to impose a conclusion through force, and to act on a belief that had not been confirmed by the process designed to confirm it. The investigation had begun as an attempt to establish truth. It had evolved into something else, something shaped not only by evidence, but by expectation, by pressure, and by the willingness of certain individuals to act when the system did not deliver the outcome they desired. And with the death of Joseph Kahahawai, the case entered a new phase, one in which the question was no longer limited to what had happened, but extended to what should happen next. The second trial did not begin in the same atmosphere as the first. The shift was immediate, almost palpable, as if the center of gravity had moved. What had once been a case defined by accusation and uncertainty now carried the weight of a confirmed act. A man had been taken, restrained, and killed. That fact was not in dispute. And yet, despite this clarity, the question of justice did not become simpler. It became more complicated. The individuals responsible for the death of Joseph Kahahawai were no longer unknown. They were identified, arrested, and brought before the legal system. Among them were Grace Fortescue and Thomas Massey, figures whose social standing ensured that their actions would be interpreted through a lens that extended beyond the facts of the case itself. From the outset, the proceedings were shaped by a different set of expectations. The first trial had revolved around the question of whether a crime had been committed against Talia Massey and whether the evidence was sufficient to prove that the accused men were responsible. The second trial, by contrast, addressed an act that had already been established. The issue was not whether the killing had occurred, but how it would be judged. In theory, the legal framework was clear. The killing of a restrained individual, carried out outside the authority of the law, constituted a serious crime. The process should have followed a predictable path, guided by statutes, precedent, and the principles that define the justice system. In practice, however, the situation was not so straightforward. Public perception began to play a significant role. In the period between the two trials, the narrative surrounding the case had shifted. The focus was no longer solely on the inconsistencies of the original accusation or the uncertainty of the evidence. Instead, attention turned toward the motivations of those who had carried out the killing. For many observers, particularly within certain segments of the American public, the actions of Fortescue and her associates were not viewed in isolation. They were interpreted as a response, as an extension of the original allegation. The absence of a conviction in the first trial was seen not as a reflection of insufficient evidence, but as a failure to deliver justice. Within this framework, the killing of Kahahawai was reframed, not as an act of unlawful violence, but as an attempt to correct that failure. This perspective did not erase the fact that a man had been killed, but it altered the way that fact was understood. It introduced a layer of justification, a narrative in which the defendants were not simply perpetrators, but individuals acting under a perceived necessity. The courtroom became the place where these competing interpretations would be tested. The prosecution presented the case in terms that emphasized the illegality of the act. They outlined the sequence of events that led to the abduction and killing, highlighting the deliberate nature of the actions taken. The victim had been taken against his will.
He had been restrained.
He had been subjected to questioning outside the bounds of the law. And ultimately, he had been shot at close range. These facts, taken together, formed the basis of a clear argument that the defendants had committed a serious crime. The defense, however, approached the case from a different angle. Rather than focusing solely on the act itself, they sought to place it within a broader context. They emphasized the emotional and psychological state of the defendants, the sense of injustice they believed had been created by the outcome of the first trial. They framed the killing not as a calculated act of violence, but as a response driven by conviction, by the belief that the legal system had failed to protect and to punish. This framing did not deny the act. Instead, it sought to reinterpret it. As the trial progressed, the influence of public opinion became increasingly evident. The defendants were not being judged in a vacuum. Their actions were being considered in relation to the broader narrative that had developed around the case. That narrative, shaped by media coverage and social attitudes, played a role in how the evidence was perceived and how the arguments were received. For the jury, this created a complex challenge. They were tasked with applying the law to a set of facts that were not in dispute, but they were also operating within an environment where those facts were embedded in a larger story. The question was not only what had happened, but how it should be interpreted. The division that had characterized the first trial did not manifest in the same way here. The clarity of the act itself reduced the scope of disagreement about the basic facts. But it did not eliminate the influence of perspective. When the verdict was reached, it reflected this complexity. The defendants were found guilty. The legal system, at least in formal terms, recognized that a crime had been committed. The act of killing Joseph Kahahawai was acknowledged as unlawful. And yet, the severity of the judgment did not align with the gravity of the act. The sentence imposed was notably lenient. It suggested that while the law had been applied, it had been applied in a way that took into account factors beyond the act itself. The motivations of the defendants, the context of the case, and the perceptions that had developed around it all appeared to influence the outcome. This leniency became even more pronounced with the intervention of Lawrence Judd. Exercising his authority, he reduced the sentence to a single hour of imprisonment. The decision transformed what might have been a significant punishment into something largely symbolic. The implications of this action were immediate and far-reaching. On one level, it reinforced the idea that the defendants were being treated differently, that their status and the narrative surrounding their actions had affected the outcome. The reduction of the sentence did not negate the guilty verdict, but it altered its practical impact. It raised questions about consistency, about whether the same considerations would have been applied in a different context, with different individuals. On another level, it contributed to the broader perception of the case. For those who had supported the defendants, the reduced sentence could be seen as validation, as an acknowledgement that their actions, while technically unlawful, were understandable within the circumstances. For others, it represented a failure of the system to uphold its own principles, a moment where the application of justice appeared to be uneven. The courtroom, which had been the site of the trial, was no longer the only place where the case was being judged. The outcome extended beyond its walls, influencing how the events were understood and remembered. The second trial, in many ways, did not resolve the case. It concluded a legal process, but it did not settle the underlying questions. It did not determine the truth of the original accusation. It did not reconcile the differing perspectives that had shaped the narrative from the beginning. Instead, it added another layer to an already complex situation. The killing of Joseph Kahahawai had introduced a new set of facts, a new point of clarity. But the response to that clarity demonstrated that facts alone were not sufficient to produce a unified understanding. Justice, in this instance, was not a fixed outcome. It was a process influenced by context, by perception, and by the interplay of power and belief. The verdict and the sentence reflected that interplay, capturing not only what had been done, but how it was viewed. And as the case moved beyond the courtroom, those views would continue to shape its legacy, ensuring that it would not be remembered simply as a legal matter, but as a moment when the boundaries of justice were tested and, for some, found wanting. In the aftermath of the trial, there was no clear sense of closure. The legal process had run its course, a verdict had been delivered, and a sentence, however brief, had been carried out. By procedural standards, the case had reached its conclusion. But beyond the formal boundaries of the courtroom, the questions it raised did not settle. They lingered, unresolved, embedded in the memory of a community that had been forced to confront not only an act of violence, but the deeper structures that shaped how that violence was understood. The death of Joseph Kahahawai did not exist in isolation. It became part of a larger narrative about power and belonging, about who was protected and who was not, and about how justice could be influenced by forces that extended beyond evidence and law. For many within the local population, particularly among Native Hawaiians, the outcome of the case reinforced a perception that the system did not operate equally for everyone. The fact that a man could be taken, killed, and yet see those responsible receive only a symbolic punishment was not easily reconciled with the idea of fairness. This perception was not formed in a vacuum. It was shaped by the broader context of life in Hawaii during that period, where social hierarchies were clearly defined and where access to influence was unevenly distributed. The case did not create these conditions, but it illuminated them in a way that made them impossible to ignore. It provided a concrete example, a moment where abstract concerns about inequality were reflected in a specific and undeniable outcome. At the same time, there were those who interpreted the events differently. For some, the actions of Grace Fortescue and her associates were seen not as a breakdown of justice, but as a response to it. They viewed the hung jury in the first trial as a failure to hold accountable those who had allegedly committed a serious crime. Within that framework, the killing of Kahahawai was reframed as an act born out of frustration, even necessity. The reduced sentence, in this view, was not an injustice, but a recognition of the circumstances that had led to the act. These opposing interpretations did not converge. They remained distinct, reflecting the divisions that had existed long before the case began. What the case did was bring those divisions into sharper focus, turning them into something that could be pointed to, discussed, and argued over. It became more than a single event. It became a reference point, a way of understanding the relationship between law, power, and society. One of the most persistent aspects of the case is the uncertainty that surrounds its origin. The initial accusation made by Talia Massey was never definitively resolved. The inconsistencies in her account, the lack of strong physical evidence, and the inability of the jury to reach a verdict left the question open. There was no final determination of what had happened on the night of September 12, 1931. That absence of certainty became a defining feature of the case. It is this uncertainty that complicates any attempt to assign clear roles of victim and perpetrator. If the original allegation cannot be conclusively proven or disproven, then the motivations behind the actions that followed become more difficult to evaluate. The killing of Kahahawai is a fact, supported by evidence, and acknowledged in court. But the context in which it occurred is shaped by a question that does not have a definitive answer. Was he an innocent man who was taken and killed without justification? Or was he someone who had been involved in a crime, but whose guilt was never legally established? The case does not provide a conclusive answer to either possibility. Instead, it leaves both open, creating a space where interpretation plays a significant role. This ambiguity is part of what gives the case its lasting impact. It resists simplification. It does not fit neatly into a narrative where good and bad are clearly defined, where justice is either served or denied in a way that can be easily agreed upon. Instead, it presents a situation where the absence of certainty becomes central, where the lack of a clear answer shapes how everything else is understood. The role of the legal system in this case is also subject to interpretation. On one level, it functioned as designed. There was an investigation, a trial, a jury deliberation, and a verdict. The processes that define the system were followed. But the outcomes of those processes raise questions about their effectiveness, about whether they were able to achieve the goal they are intended to serve. The hung jury in the first trial suggests that the system was not able to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In that sense, it operated as a safeguard, preventing a conviction in the absence of sufficient evidence. The second trial, however, introduces a different dynamic. The guilty verdict acknowledges that a crime was committed, but the leniency of the sentence, particularly after the intervention of Lawrence Judd, suggests that other factors influenced the outcome. This combination of procedural correctness and perceived inconsistency creates a tension that is not easily resolved. It raises questions about what justice means in practice, about how it is applied, and about the extent to which it is influenced by context. For those who study cases like this, the Massey case is often seen as an example of how legal systems can be shaped by the societies in which they operate. The law does not exist in isolation. It is interpreted and applied by individuals who are part of a broader social structure, who carry with them beliefs, biases, and assumptions. These elements do not necessarily override the law, but they can influence how it is understood and how it is enforced. The case also highlights the consequences of taking justice into one's own hands. The decision to abduct and kill Kahahawai was made outside the boundaries of the legal system. It was an assertion that those involved had the authority to determine the truth and to act on it. The outcome of that decision, both in terms of the act itself and the response to it, demonstrates the risks inherent in that approach. When individuals bypass the legal system, they remove the safeguards that are designed to ensure fairness and accuracy. They replace a structured process with personal judgment, with all the limitations that entails. In this case, that decision resulted in the death of a man whose guilt had not been established, and in a legal outcome that left many questioning whether justice had been served. The legacy of the case is not confined to the events themselves. It extends into the way those events are remembered, discussed, and interpreted over time. It continues to be referenced as a moment when the boundaries of justice were tested, when the relationship between law and power was made visible in a way that could not be ignored. In the end, the Massey case does not provide clear answers. It does not resolve the questions it raises in a way that satisfies all perspectives. Instead, it leaves behind a series of unresolved issues, a set of tensions that continue to resonate. It returns, in a sense, to the image with which the story began. A car moving through the night, a confined space where decisions are made without oversight, where the absence of certainty is replaced by the assertion of belief. A single act that carries consequences far beyond the moment in which it occurs. Sometimes, the most unsettling aspect of a case is not the violence itself, but the way that violence is understood. The Massey case endures not because it offers a clear narrative, but because it does not. It forces a confrontation with the possibility that justice is not always determined by facts alone, but by the ways in which those facts are interpreted, and by the power of those who interpret them. And in that space, between what is known and what is believed, the line between justice and something else becomes difficult to see. There is a tendency, when looking back at cases like this, to search for a final point of resolution, a moment where everything settles into place and the narrative closes in a way that feels complete. But the story of what happened in Hawaii in 1931 and 1932 resists that kind of ending. Even after the trials, even after the sentences were handed down and served, something remained unsettled, as if the case had ended in form but not in meaning. In the years that followed, the events surrounding the death of Joseph Kahahawai did not disappear into obscurity. They continued to exist in conversation, in memory, in the quiet ways that communities hold onto moments that have shaped them. The case became a reference point, not because it offered clear answers, but because it exposed questions that were difficult to ignore. For some, it was a story about failure. A failure of the legal system to establish truth in the first trial, and a failure to deliver proportionate accountability in the second. The hung jury, followed by a conviction that resulted in a minimal sentence, created an impression that justice had been uneven, that it had shifted depending on who was involved and how they were perceived. For others, it was a story about action. A moment where individuals stepped in when they believed the system had fallen short, where they acted according to their own understanding of what was right. This interpretation did not deny the violence of what had occurred, but it reframed it, placing emphasis on motive rather than outcome. These perspectives did not reconcile over time. If anything, they became more defined, more deeply rooted. The distance from the events themselves did not bring clarity. Instead, it allowed the case to take on a kind of symbolic weight, representing different things to different people. One of the most enduring aspects of the case is the way it complicates the idea of certainty. At its center lies an unresolved question, one that cannot be answered definitively based on the available information. The accusation made by Talia Massey remains uncertain, marked by inconsistencies and a lack of conclusive evidence. That uncertainty does not diminish the seriousness of the claim, but it does limit the ability to establish it as fact. This unresolved origin shapes everything that follows. It influences how the actions of those involved are interpreted, how responsibility is assigned, and how the concept of justice is understood. Without a clear starting point, the narrative becomes fluid, open to interpretation in ways that a more definitive case would not be. It is within this space of uncertainty that the actions leading to Kahahawai's death take on their full complexity. If the original accusation cannot be confirmed, then the justification for what followed becomes more difficult to sustain. At the same time, the absence of a definitive answer does not automatically negate the belief held by those who acted. It simply places that belief in a context where it cannot be verified. This tension between belief and proof is central to the lasting impact of the case. It highlights the difference between what people feel to be true and what can be demonstrated as true, and it shows how that difference can influence behavior in significant ways. The legal outcomes of the case further complicate this dynamic. The conviction of those responsible for the killing acknowledges that a crime occurred, but the leniency of the sentence, particularly after the intervention of Lawrence Judd, introduces an element of inconsistency. It suggests that while the law was applied, it was applied in a way that was influenced by factors beyond the act itself. This raises broader questions about the nature of justice. Is justice defined solely by adherence to legal procedures, or does it also require consistency in how those procedures are applied? Can a system be considered fair if its outcomes vary significantly based on context, even when the underlying principles remain the same? In the case of the Massey incident, these questions do not have straightforward answers. The system functioned in a technical sense, but the results it produced were interpreted in different ways, depending on perspective. For the local population, particularly those who identified with Kahahawai, the outcome reinforced a sense of exclusion. It suggested that the protections offered by the law were not equally distributed, that some lives were valued differently than others within the structure of society. This perception was not created by the case alone, but the case provided a clear example that could be pointed to, a moment where abstract concerns became concrete. For those aligned with the Massey family, the outcome could be seen as a recognition of the circumstances that had led to the act. It acknowledged, at least implicitly, the emotional and social pressures that had influenced their decisions. This interpretation does not eliminate the legal judgment, but it places it within a broader framework that includes factors beyond the act itself. The coexistence of these interpretations is part of what gives the case its enduring significance. It is not a story that resolves into a single narrative. Instead, it remains open, subject to reinterpretation as it is revisited over time. In examining cases like this, there is often a desire to draw lessons, to identify what can be learned and how those lessons can be applied. The Massey case offers several possibilities in this regard, but they are not presented in a straightforward way. They emerge through reflection, through consideration of the complexities involved. One such lesson concerns the importance of process. The legal system is designed to operate within defined boundaries, to ensure that decisions are made based on evidence and that individuals are protected from arbitrary action. When those boundaries are bypassed, as they were in the abduction and killing of Kahahawai, the consequences extend beyond the immediate act. They affect the integrity of the system itself, raising questions about its role and its effectiveness. Another lesson relates to the influence of context. The case demonstrates how social, cultural, and political factors can shape the way events are perceived and judged. These factors do not operate independently of the law, but they interact with it, influencing how it is applied and how its outcomes are understood. Perhaps the most difficult lesson, however, is the recognition that not all cases provide clear answers. Some remain unresolved, not because of a lack of effort, but because the available information does not support a definitive conclusion. In such cases, the challenge is not to force a resolution, but to acknowledge the uncertainty and to consider what it reveals. The story returns, in a way, to the image that has followed it from the beginning. A confined space, a moment of decision, a choice made in the absence of certainty. The car in which Joseph Kahahawai lost his life becomes more than a setting. It becomes a symbol of the broader dynamics at play, a representation of what can happen when belief takes precedence over proof, when the desire for resolution overrides the need for verification. In the end, the Massey case does not ask to be understood in simple terms. It resists reduction, holding onto its complexities in a way that requires careful consideration. It is a story about people, about actions, and about the systems that seek to regulate those actions. But it is also a story about the limits of those systems, about what happens when they are tested and where they may fall short. And perhaps that is why it endures. Not because it provides clarity, but because it challenges the idea that clarity is always possible. It invites reflection, not just on what happened, but on how we interpret what happens and on the role that interpretation plays in shaping our understanding of justice. In that sense, the case is not confined to its time or place. It extends beyond Honolulu, beyond the specific individuals involved, into a broader conversation about law, power, and the human need to make sense of events that do not easily resolve. And in that conversation, the questions raised by the case continue to matter, not because they can be answered, but because they remind us of the importance of asking them. In the final examination of the case, what remains is not a single narrative, but a convergence of unresolved threads, each one pointing in a different direction, each one resisting closure in its own way. The events that unfolded in Hawaii during 1931 and 1932 do not settle into a definitive conclusion. Instead, they continue to exist as a set of tensions, suspended between competing interpretations of truth, responsibility, and justice. At the center of it all is a sequence that cannot be untangled from its beginning. A claim was made by Talia Massey, a claim that carried immediate weight because of who she was and the environment in which she lived. Her account set the process in motion, initiating an investigation that moved forward despite the presence of inconsistencies and the absence of strong physical evidence. That process led to arrests, to a trial, and ultimately to a failure to reach a verdict. From that point, the narrative shifted. The legal system, having been unable to provide a definitive conclusion, created a space in which other actions could occur. It was within that space that Joseph Kahahawai was taken, questioned, and killed. His death introduced a new certainty into the case, a fact that could not be disputed in the way the original accusation had been. And yet, even with that certainty, the case did not resolve. The second trial acknowledged the killing, recognized it as a crime, and produced a guilty verdict. But the sentence that followed, particularly after the intervention of Lawrence Judd, transformed that acknowledgement into something less definitive. It suggested that while the act itself was not in question, the context in which it occurred had influenced how it was judged. This interplay between fact and interpretation is what defines the enduring complexity of the case. It is not simply a matter of what happened, but of how what happened was understood and how those understandings shaped the outcomes that followed. For those who seek a clear resolution, the case offers none. The original accusation remains unproven. The motivations behind the actions taken in response to that accusation are tied to beliefs that cannot be verified. The legal outcomes, while formally complete, do not align neatly with a single conception of justice. Instead, the case presents a series of contrasts. There is the contrast between allegation and evidence, between what is claimed and what can be demonstrated. There is the contrast between legal process and personal action, between the structured mechanisms of the courtroom and the unregulated decisions made outside it. And there is the contrast between different interpretations of the same events, shaped by perspective, by context, and by the identities of those involved. These contrasts do not cancel each other out. They coexist, creating a layered narrative that resists simplification. In examining this narrative, it becomes clear that the concept of justice is not as fixed as it might appear. It is influenced by the systems that define it, but also by the people who operate within those systems. It is shaped by rules and procedures, but also by beliefs and perceptions. And when those elements do not align, the result is not always clarity. The Massey case illustrates this dynamic in a way that is difficult to ignore. It shows how a legal system can function according to its procedures and still produce outcomes that are interpreted as inconsistent or incomplete. It shows how actions taken outside that system can be both condemned and justified, depending on the perspective from which they are viewed. Perhaps most importantly, it shows how uncertainty can persist even in the presence of decisive events. The death of Joseph Kahahawai is not uncertain. It is a documented fact, supported by evidence and acknowledged in court. But the meaning of that fact is not fixed. It is influenced by the unresolved questions that preceded it, by the interpretations that followed it, and by the broader context in which it is placed. This is what gives the case its lasting significance. It is not simply a historical event, but a point of reflection, a moment that invites reconsideration of how justice is defined and applied. In returning to the beginning of the story, to the night when Talia Massey made her accusation, it is possible to see how each subsequent development was shaped by what came before. The inconsistencies in her account did not stop the investigation, but they introduced uncertainty. The lack of a verdict in the first trial did not resolve that uncertainty, but it created a gap in which other actions could occur. The killing of Kahahawai did not answer the original question, but it shifted the focus, adding a new dimension to the case. Each step built upon the previous one, not in a straight line, but in a way that layered complexity upon complexity. By the time the case reached its legal conclusion, it had become something more than the sum of its parts. It had become a reflection of the society in which it occurred, a demonstration of how law, power, and belief can intersect in ways that produce outcomes that are difficult to reconcile. In the years since, the case has been revisited, re-examined, and reinterpreted. It has been discussed not only in terms of its specific details, but in terms of what it represents. It serves as an example of how justice can be influenced by context, how legal processes can be both effective and limited, and how the absence of certainty can shape the way events are understood. It also serves as a reminder of the consequences of acting on belief in the absence of proof. The decision to take Joseph Kahahawai and to subject him to extrajudicial questioning was based on a conviction that had not been confirmed by the legal system. That decision led to his death, an outcome that cannot be undone and that continues to shape the interpretation of the case. At the same time, the case underscores the challenges faced by legal systems in situations where evidence is incomplete or inconsistent. The inability to reach a verdict in the first trial was not necessarily a failure, but a reflection of the limitations of the available information. It demonstrated the principle that guilt must be established beyond a reasonable doubt, even in cases where the pressure to reach a conclusion is strong. These dual realities, the the consequences of acting outside the law and the limitations of acting within it create a tension that lies at the heart of the case. As the narrative comes to a close, there is no final resolution to offer. The questions that have been raised remain open, not because they have been overlooked, but because they cannot be conclusively answered. What happened on the night of September 12, 1931, cannot be fully reconstructed based on the available information. The motivations behind the actions that followed cannot be definitively verified. The outcomes of the legal process, while documented, do not provide a single, unified interpretation of justice. Instead, what remains is a series of perspectives, each one shaped by different assumptions, different priorities, and different understandings of what the case represents. In that sense, the Massey case is not a story with a clear ending. It is a story that continues, not in the sense that new events are occurring, but in the sense that its meaning is still being considered. It invites reflection, not only on the specific details of what happened, but on the broader questions that those details raise. It challenges the assumption that justice is always clear, always consistent, always aligned with truth. And it reminds us that in some cases, the search for certainty may lead not to answers, but to a deeper understanding of the complexity of the questions themselves. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of all. Not the events, not the verdicts, but the realization that even when a case is closed, its implications can remain open, continuing to shape the way we think about law, power, and the fragile line that separates them. If there is a final place to stand when looking back at the case, it is not at the moment of the crime, nor at the verdict delivered in court, but somewhere in between, in the space where interpretation begins. Because what happened in Hawaii during those years does not simply exist as a sequence of events. It exists as a question that continues to be asked, not with the expectation of a definitive answer, but with the understanding that the act of asking is itself part of what gives the case its meaning. At its core, the story revolves around a conflict between two forms of certainty. The first is the certainty claimed by Talia Massey when she stated that she had been attacked. Her account, despite its inconsistencies, carried an internal conviction, a belief that something had happened to her that required acknowledgement and response. That kind of certainty does not depend entirely on external validation. It exists within the person who expresses it, shaped by perception, by memory, and by experience. The second form of certainty is the one demanded by the legal system. It requires evidence, consistency, and the ability to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that a particular event occurred in a particular way and that specific individuals were responsible. This form of certainty is structured, defined by rules that are designed to protect against error, to prevent conclusions from being drawn without sufficient support. The tension between these two forms of certainty is evident from the beginning of the case. The account provided by Massey did not fully align with the requirements of legal proof. It contained gaps, variations, elements that could not be firmly established. And yet, it was compelling enough to initiate an investigation, to lead to arrests, and to bring the case to trial. When the trial failed to produce a verdict, that tension did not resolve. It intensified. The legal system had not confirmed the certainty expressed in the accusation, but it had not disproven it either. It had left the question open, suspended between belief and doubt. For some, that suspension was unacceptable. The actions that followed, culminating in the death of Joseph Kahahawai, can be understood as an attempt to resolve that tension by replacing legal uncertainty with personal certainty. The individuals involved did not wait for the system to produce an answer. They acted on the answer they believed was already clear. This shift from legal process to personal action represents a fundamental change in the way the case is approached. It moves from a framework based on shared rules and procedures to one based on individual judgment. And in doing so, it introduces a new set of risks, new possibilities for error, and new consequences. The death of Kahahawai is the most immediate of those consequences. It is the point at which belief becomes action, where the abstract question of what happened is replaced by the concrete reality of what was done. His death is not subject to the same uncertainties as the original accusation. It is a fact, established by evidence, acknowledged in court. And yet, even here, interpretation plays a role. The meaning of that act is not fixed. It is shaped by the context in which it occurred, by the beliefs that motivated it, and by the responses it elicited. For some, it is a clear example of injustice, the killing of a man who had not been proven guilty of any crime. For others, it is seen as a response to a different injustice, an action taken when the system failed to provide the outcome they believed was necessary. These interpretations do not cancel each other out. They coexist, reflecting the complexity of the case and the different ways in which it can be understood. The role of the legal system in this context becomes particularly significant. In the second trial, the system acknowledges the act of killing and delivers a guilty verdict. This suggests that, at least in formal terms, the law has been upheld. But the leniency of the sentence, especially following the intervention of Lawrence Judd, complicates that conclusion. It raises the question of whether justice has been fully realized or whether it has been adjusted in response to factors that lie outside the strict application of the law. It suggests that the system, while operating according to its procedures, is also responsive to the context in which it operates, to the pressures and perceptions that surround it. This responsiveness is not necessarily a flaw. It reflects the reality that legal systems are part of broader societies, that they do not exist in isolation. But it does introduce a degree of variability, a potential for outcomes to differ based on circumstances that are not directly related to the facts of the case. In the Massey case, this variability becomes a central feature. It is evident in the contrast between the first trial, where the absence of sufficient evidence prevents a conviction, and the second trial, where the presence of clear evidence leads to a conviction but not to a proportionate sentence. This contrast highlights the challenges inherent in balancing the need for certainty with the realities of human judgment. It shows how the same system can produce different outcomes based on the nature of the evidence and the context in which it is considered. Beyond the legal framework, the case also invites reflection on the role of belief in shaping action. The individuals who took part in the abduction and killing of Kahahawai did so because they believed they were justified. That belief was not confirmed by the legal system, but it was strong enough to override the constraints that the system imposed. This raises difficult questions about the relationship between belief and responsibility. To what extent can belief justify action, particularly when that action results in harm? And how should such actions be judged when they are motivated by a conviction that cannot be definitively proven or disproven? The case does not provide clear answers to these questions. Instead, it presents them in a way that resists easy resolution. It shows how belief can drive action, but also how that action can lead to consequences that extend beyond the original intent. As the narrative reaches its final stage, it becomes clear that the Massey case is not simply about a series of events, but about the interplay between those events and the ways in which they are understood. It is about the gap between what can be known and what is believed, and about how that gap influences decisions, actions, and outcomes. The image that remains is not one of closure, but of continuation. The car in which Joseph Kahahawai was killed is no longer moving, but the questions that arose from that moment continue to travel, extending beyond the confines of the case itself. They move into broader considerations of justice, of fairness, of the role of the legal system, and of the ways in which individuals respond when that system does not produce the answers they expect. They challenge the assumption that every case can be resolved in a way that satisfies all perspectives, and they highlight the complexities that arise when certainty is elusive. In the end, the Massey case does not offer a final conclusion. It offers a framework for thinking, a set of circumstances that can be examined from multiple angles, each one revealing different aspects of the same story. It is a reminder that justice is not always a destination, something that can be clearly reached and defined. Sometimes, it is a process, ongoing, incomplete, shaped by the interactions between law, belief, and the realities of the world in which they exist. And in that process, the case continues to live, not as a closed chapter, but as an open question, one that invites consideration, reflection, and, perhaps most importantly, an awareness of the limits of certainty. There is a moment, in every case that lingers, when the details begin to fade but the questions remain. Names become less immediate, dates less precise, but the underlying tension refuses to disappear. The story of what happened in Hawaii during 1931 and 1932 has reached that point. It exists no longer as a sequence that demands resolution, but as a structure that continues to hold meaning, shaped not only by what occurred, but by how it has been remembered and reconsidered over time. In the end, the case does not belong entirely to the courtroom, nor to the individuals directly involved. It belongs to the space between them, to the intersection of law, belief, and society. It is there that its significance becomes most apparent, not as a singular event, but as an example of how these elements interact under pressure. The figure of Joseph Kahahawai remains central to this understanding, not only because of the way his life ended, but because of what that ending represents. He was a man who, at the time of his death, had not been convicted of the crime for which he was suspected. His status was unresolved, defined by accusation rather than proof. And yet, the actions taken against him treated that accusation as if it had already been confirmed. This transformation, from suspect to target, is one of the most significant aspects of the case. It illustrates how the absence of a legal conclusion can be replaced by a personal one, how uncertainty can give way to assumption, and how that assumption can lead to irreversible consequences. At the same time, the presence of Talia Massey within the narrative complicates any attempt to define the case in simple terms. Her account, which initiated the entire sequence of events, remains unresolved. It cannot be fully validated, but neither can it be dismissed outright. It exists in a state of ambiguity, influencing everything that followed without ever being definitively established. This duality, between an unproven accusation and a proven act of violence, creates a tension that runs throughout the case. It prevents the narrative from settling into a single perspective, forcing it instead to accommodate multiple interpretations. For those who focus on the legal aspects, the case can be seen as a demonstration of the strengths and limitations of the system. The first trial, which ended in a hung jury, reflects the principle that conviction requires certainty. The second trial, which resulted in a guilty verdict, shows that the system is capable of recognizing and responding to clear evidence. But the disparity between the two outcomes, particularly in terms of sentencing, highlights the influence of context, suggesting that the application of the law is not entirely independent of the environment in which it operates. The intervention of Lawrence Judd further emphasizes this point. By reducing the sentence to a symbolic duration, he introduced a level of discretion that altered the practical meaning of the verdict. This action did not negate the finding of guilt, but it reshaped its consequences, demonstrating how authority can modify the outcomes produced by the legal process. For those who view the case through a broader social lens, these elements take on additional significance. The disparities in how the individuals involved were treated, the differences in perception based on identity and status, and the reactions of the public all contribute to an understanding of the case as a reflection of the society in which it occurred. In this context, the case becomes more than a legal matter. It becomes a representation of how power operates, how it influences not only actions but also interpretations, and how it can shape the way justice is both pursued and perceived. The role of the public in this process cannot be overlooked. The case was not confined to the courtroom. It was discussed, debated, and interpreted by those who followed it, each bringing their own perspectives and assumptions. These interpretations did not remain separate from the legal process. They interacted with it, influencing the environment in which decisions were made and understood. This interaction between public perception and legal outcome is another layer of complexity within the case. It shows how justice is not only determined by evidence and procedure, but also by the context in which those elements are considered. It raises questions about the extent to which external factors should influence legal decisions and about the challenges of maintaining objectivity in situations where emotions and beliefs are strongly engaged. As the case moves further into the past, its details become part of a larger narrative, one that is revisited and reinterpreted over time. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects, highlights different tensions, and draws different conclusions. This process of reinterpretation does not change the facts of the case, but it does influence how those facts are understood. In this sense, the case is not static. It evolves not through new events, but through new perspectives. It becomes a point of reference for discussions about justice, about the role of the legal system, and about the ways in which individuals respond to uncertainty. One of the most enduring questions raised by the case concerns the relationship between justice and certainty. The legal system is designed to operate within a framework that prioritizes proof, that requires a high standard of evidence before a conclusion can be reached. This standard is intended to protect against error, to ensure that decisions are based on reliable information. But what happens when that standard cannot be met, when the available evidence does not support a definitive conclusion? The Massey case provides one possible answer. It shows that in such situations, uncertainty can persist, and that this persistence can lead to actions that fall outside the boundaries of the system. The decision to act on belief rather than proof is not unique to this case, but the consequences it produced here are particularly stark. The death of Joseph Kahahawai is a reminder of the risks involved in replacing legal certainty with personal conviction. It demonstrates how the absence of a definitive answer can create conditions in which individuals feel justified in imposing their own conclusions. At the same time, the case highlights the limitations of the legal system in addressing all aspects of human experience. The system is designed to evaluate evidence, to determine guilt or innocence based on defined criteria. But it does not always provide resolution in the emotional or social sense. It does not always satisfy the need for closure, for a clear and definitive understanding of what has occurred. This gap between legal resolution and personal perception is another source of tension within the case. It explains, in part, why the outcome of the first trial was not accepted by all involved and why the actions that followed were seen by some as necessary, even if they were not legally justified. As the narrative reaches its final point, it becomes clear that the Massey case cannot be reduced to a single lesson or a single interpretation. It contains multiple layers, each of which offers a different perspective on the relationship between law, belief, and action. It is a story about a claim that could not be definitively proven, about a response that resulted in a confirmed act of violence, and about a legal process that addressed that act in a way that remains open to interpretation. It is a story about the limits of certainty, about the influence of context, and about the consequences of acting in the absence of clear answers. And perhaps most importantly, it is a story that continues to resonate because it does not resolve easily. It does not provide the kind of closure that allows it to be set aside without further thought. Instead, it remains present, inviting reflection, raising questions, and challenging assumptions. In that sense, the case does not end here. It extends beyond its final chapter into the broader conversation about what justice means and how it is pursued. It becomes part of an ongoing exploration, one that does not seek to eliminate uncertainty, but to understand its role in shaping the decisions we make and the systems we rely on. And in that exploration, the events that took place in Honolulu continue to matter, not because they can be fully resolved, but because they remind us of the complexity inherent in every attempt to define what is true, what is fair, and what is just. By the time the story reaches what could be called its final chapter, the events themselves no longer stand alone. They have been absorbed into something larger, something that extends beyond the immediate facts and into the way those facts continue to shape understanding. What happened in Hawaii during the early 1930s does not remain confined to its own time. It lingers, not as a fixed conclusion, but as a continuing presence, influencing how questions of justice, truth, and power are approached long after the individuals involved are gone. The names remain, carrying with them the weight of what occurred. Talia Massey, whose accusations set everything in motion, exists within the narrative as both a central figure and an unresolved question. Her account, marked by inconsistencies and a lack of definitive evidence, cannot be fully validated, yet it cannot be dismissed either. It occupies a space that is neither confirmed nor disproven, and it is this ambiguity that gives it lasting influence. In contrast, the fate of Joseph Kahahawai is not ambiguous. His death is a matter of record, established by evidence and acknowledged in court. There is no uncertainty about what happened to him, only about why it happened and whether it could have been prevented. This difference between uncertainty and certainty lies at the heart of the case, creating a tension that continues to define how it is remembered. The actions that led to his death did not emerge from a vacuum. They were shaped by the outcome of the first trial, by the inability of the legal system to provide a definitive answer, and by the beliefs held by those who felt that answer was already clear. When Grace Fortescue and Thomas Massey chose to act, they did so in response to a perceived failure of justice. They replaced the uncertainty of the legal process with the certainty of their own judgment. This decision, while rooted in belief, had consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. It transformed the case from one centered on an unresolved accusation into one defined by a confirmed act of violence. It shifted the focus from what might have happened to what undeniably did. The legal system responded to this shift in a way that both affirmed and complicated its role. The second trial resulted in a guilty verdict, acknowledging that the killing of Kahahawai was a crime. But the leniency of the sentence, particularly after the intervention of Lawrence Judd, introduced a level of inconsistency that continues to be debated. This inconsistency is not simply a matter of legal procedure. It reflects the broader context in which the case existed, a context shaped by social hierarchies, by perceptions of identity, and by the distribution of power. The outcome of the trial cannot be fully understood without considering these factors, just as the actions that led to the trial cannot be separated from the beliefs that motivated them. In this way, the case becomes a reflection of the society in which it occurred. It reveals how legal systems operate within larger social structures, how they are influenced by the values and assumptions of the people who participate in them, and how their outcomes can be shaped by forces that extend beyond the evidence presented in court. The passage of time does not resolve these issues. Instead, it allows them to be examined from different perspectives. Historians, legal scholars, and observers have returned to the case, not to find a definitive answer, but to explore what it reveals about the relationship between law and society. Each examination highlights different aspects, emphasizing the complexity of the case and the difficulty of drawing clear conclusions. One of the most persistent themes in these examinations is the question of fairness. Was justice served in the Massey case? The answer depends on how justice is defined. If it is understood as adherence to legal procedure, then the system functioned as intended. There was an investigation, a trial, a verdict, and a sentence. But if justice is understood as the equitable application of the law, then the outcome raises concerns. The disparity between the act committed and the punishment imposed suggests that factors beyond the law influence the result. This tension between procedure and equity is not unique to this case, but it is particularly visible here. It highlights the challenges faced by legal systems in balancing the need for consistency with the realities of human judgment. It shows how even a system designed to be impartial can produce outcomes that are perceived as uneven. The role of public perception in shaping these outcomes cannot be ignored. The case attracted significant attention, and the way it was presented and discussed influenced how it was understood. Public opinion did not determine the verdict, but it contributed to the environment in which the trial took place. It shaped expectations, influenced interpretations, and added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. As the narrative reaches its final stage, it becomes clear that the Massey case does not offer a resolution in the traditional sense. It does not provide a clear answer to the question of what happened on the night of September 12, 1931. It does not fully reconcile the actions that followed. And it does not produce a universally accepted interpretation of justice. Instead, it offers something more difficult and perhaps more important. It offers a recognition of complexity, an acknowledgement that some cases cannot be reduced to simple narratives or definitive conclusions. It challenges the assumption that every question has a clear answer, and it invites a deeper consideration of the factors that shape how those answers are sought. The image that remains is not one of closure, but of continuation. The events that took place in Honolulu continue to resonate, not because they are unresolved in a procedural sense, but because they raise questions that extend beyond their immediate context. They speak to the nature of justice, to the role of belief, and to the ways in which individuals and systems respond to uncertainty. In the end, the Massey case endures not because it provides clarity, but because it does not. It remains a point of reflection, a moment in which the boundaries of law and power were tested and found to be more fluid than they might appear. It serves as a reminder that justice is not always a fixed outcome, but a process shaped by the interplay of evidence, belief, and context. And in that interplay, the story continues, not as a closed chapter, but as an open question, one that invites ongoing reflection and consideration. There comes a point in every story where the facts have all been laid out, where the sequence of events has been examined from every available angle, and where the legal process has delivered whatever conclusion it can. And yet, even at that point, something remains unfinished. The Massey case, rooted in the events that unfolded in Hawaii, does not conclude with certainty. Instead, it leaves behind a landscape of unresolved meaning, a quiet but persistent sense that the story cannot be contained within the boundaries of what is known. What endures most is not the violence itself, though that violence is undeniable, but the way it reshaped the understanding of justice for those who witnessed it and those who would later study it. The death of Joseph Kahahawai stands as a fixed point within the narrative, a moment where uncertainty gave way to irreversible action. Unlike the accusation that preceded it, his death is not subject to dispute. It is established, documented, and acknowledged. But the meaning of that act, the reasons behind it, and the way it was judged remain open to interpretation. The unresolved nature of the original accusation made by Talia Massey continues to cast a long shadow over everything that followed. Her claim initiated the sequence of events, setting in motion an investigation that struggled to find clarity. The inconsistencies in her account, combined with the lack of strong physical evidence, prevented the legal system from reaching a definitive conclusion. That absence of resolution created a space in which belief, rather than proof, became the driving force behind subsequent actions. It is within that space that the most significant transformation occurred. The case shifted from one defined by uncertainty to one defined by certainty, not because the original question had been answered, but because a new, undeniable act had taken place. The killing of Kahahawai did not resolve the question of whether a crime had been committed against Massey, but it did introduce a separate and undeniable crime, one that demanded its own response. The legal system responded in a way that both affirmed its principles and exposed its limitations. The conviction of those responsible for the killing acknowledged that the act was unlawful. It demonstrated that the system was capable of recognizing and addressing clear evidence. But the leniency of the sentence, particularly after the intervention of Lawrence Judd, complicated that affirmation. It suggested that the application of justice was not solely determined by the act itself, but also by the context in which it occurred. This interplay between fact and context is one of the defining features of the case. It illustrates how justice is not applied in a vacuum, but within a framework shaped by social, cultural, and political influences. The individuals involved were not anonymous figures. They were part of a society structured by hierarchy and inequality, where identity and status influenced perception and outcome. For many within the local population, the case reinforced a sense of imbalance, a perception that the protections offered by the law were not equally distributed. The fact that a man could be killed under such circumstances and that those responsible would receive only a symbolic punishment was not easily reconciled with the idea of fairness. It became an example, a concrete instance that could be pointed to when discussing broader concerns about justice and equality. At the same time, there were those who interpreted the events through a different lens. For them, the actions of Grace Fortescue and her associates were not seen as a violation of justice, but as a response to its failure. They viewed the hung jury in the first trial as evidence that the system had not fulfilled its role, and they interpreted the subsequent actions as an attempt to correct that failure. This perspective did not deny the act of killing, but it placed it within a narrative that emphasized motive over outcome. These differing interpretations did not converge over time. Instead, they became part of the case's legacy, shaping how it is remembered and discussed. The Massey case is not a story that resolves into a single, agreed-upon narrative. It remains contested, its meaning shaped by the perspectives of those who engage with it. One of the most significant aspects of this legacy is the way it challenges assumptions about certainty. The legal system is designed to operate on the basis of evidence, to establish facts, and to apply the law accordingly. But the Massey case demonstrates that there are situations where evidence is incomplete, where facts cannot be fully established, and where the system must operate within those limitations. In such situations, the absence of certainty does not prevent action. It creates a space in which other forms of certainty, based on belief or perception, can emerge. These forms of certainty may not meet the standards required by the legal system, but they can still be powerful enough to influence behavior, as they did in this case. The consequences of acting on such certainty are evident in the outcome. The death of Kahahawai is a reminder of what can happen when belief overrides the constraints of evidence and process. It is a demonstration of the risks inherent in replacing structured systems with personal judgment, particularly in matters where the stakes are high. At the same time, the case also highlights the limitations of those structured systems. The inability of the first trial to reach a verdict reflects the challenges of applying legal standards to complex and uncertain situations. It shows that the requirement for proof beyond a reasonable doubt, while essential for protecting against wrongful conviction, can also result in unresolved cases. This duality, the risks of acting outside the system and the limitations of acting within it, creates a tension that runs throughout the case. It is a tension that does not resolve, but instead persists, shaping the way the case is understood. As the narrative reaches its final stage, it becomes clear that the Massey case is not defined by its conclusion, but by its lack of one. It does not provide a clear answer to the question of what happened on the night of September 12, 1931. It does not fully reconcile the actions that followed. And it does not produce a universally accepted interpretation of justice. Instead, it offers a framework for reflection, a way of considering the complexities that arise when evidence, belief, and power intersect. It invites a deeper examination of how justice is defined and applied, and of the factors that influence those processes. The image that remains is not one of resolution, but of persistence. The events that took place in Honolulu continue to resonate, not because they are unresolved in a procedural sense, but because they raise questions that extend beyond their immediate context. They speak to the nature of justice, to the role of belief, and to the ways in which individuals and systems respond to uncertainty. In the end, the Massey case endures because it refuses to be simplified. It resists the kind of closure that would allow it to be set aside without further thought. Instead, it remains present, a reminder that not all questions can be answered, and that the absence of answers can be as significant as their presence. And in that absence, in that space between what is known and what is believed, the case continues to exist, not as a finished story, but as an ongoing inquiry into the nature of truth, justice, and the fragile balance between them. What remains, after everything has been examined and retold, is not simply a case, but a question that refuses to disappear. The events that unfolded in Hawaii during the early 1930s continue to echo, not because they are unclear in every detail, but because the clarity that does exist does not resolve the uncertainty that surrounds it. The story holds together in fragments, each piece solid on its own, yet resistant to forming a single, unified truth. At the center of this enduring tension is the contrast between what can be proven and what is believed. The accusation made by Talia Massey remains one of the most significant and unresolved elements of the case. It is a claim that initiated a chain of events with irreversible consequences, yet it stands on a foundation that was never fully secured. The inconsistencies in her account, the absence of definitive physical evidence, and the inability of the jury to reach a verdict left her story suspended between acceptance and doubt. This suspension did not neutralize the impact of her words. Instead, it amplified it in a different way. Without a clear resolution, the accusation became something that could be interpreted according to perspective, shaped by the beliefs and biases of those who encountered it. For some, it was an account that demanded action, regardless of the lack of legal confirmation. For others, it was a claim that required caution, a reminder of the necessity of proof before judgment. Between these interpretations lies the space where the most consequential decisions were made. The death of Joseph Kahahawai stands as the point where belief and action converged in a way that could not be undone. His killing transformed the case from one defined by uncertainty into one marked by a definitive act. It created a new reality, one that demanded its own response and its own interpretation. Yet even this act, clear as it is in its occurrence, does not resolve the questions that preceded it. Instead, it deepens them. If the original accusation cannot be conclusively proven, then the justification for what followed becomes uncertain. If, on the other hand, the accusation holds some truth that could not be legally established, then the failure of the system to recognize that truth becomes part of the narrative. This dual possibility ensures that the case cannot be settled into a single interpretation. It remains open, its meaning shifting depending on the perspective from which it is viewed. The legal response to Kahahawai's death adds another layer to this complexity. The conviction of those responsible acknowledges the illegality of the act, affirming that the killing was a crime. But the leniency of the sentence, particularly after the intervention of Lawrence Judd, introduces an element of inconsistency that cannot be ignored. This inconsistency does not erase the conviction, but it alters its significance. It suggests that while the law was applied, it was applied in a way that was influenced by factors beyond the act itself. It reflects the broader context in which the case existed, a context shaped by social hierarchies and by the distribution of power. For many, this outcome reinforced a sense of imbalance, a perception that justice was not administered equally. The idea that a man could be killed under such circumstances and that those responsible would receive only a symbolic punishment challenged the notion of fairness. It raised questions about whether the legal system was capable of delivering justice in a way that was consistent and impartial. For others, the outcome was interpreted differently. The reduced sentence was seen as an acknowledgement of the circumstances that led to the act, a recognition that the defendants were not acting without cause. This perspective does not deny the crime, but it places it within a framework that considers motive as well as action. These differing interpretations continue to coexist, each supported by its own reasoning, each reflecting a different understanding of what justice requires. The enduring significance of the case lies in this coexistence. It is not a story that resolves into agreement, but one that maintains its divisions, its uncertainties, and its contradictions. It challenges the assumption that truth can always be clearly established and that justice can always be clearly defined. In examining the case, it becomes evident that the concept of justice is not as stable as it might appear. It is shaped by the systems that define it, but also by the people who interpret and apply those systems. It is influenced by evidence, but also by perception. And when these elements do not align, the result is not clarity, but complexity. The Massey case illustrates this dynamic in a way that is both specific and universal. It is rooted in a particular time and place, in the social and political conditions of early 20th century Hawaii. But the questions it raises extend beyond that context, touching on broader issues that remain relevant. How should the legal system respond when evidence is insufficient to establish a definitive conclusion? What role should belief play in shaping action, particularly when that action has irreversible consequences? How can justice be defined in a way that is both consistent and responsive to context? These questions do not have simple answers, and the case does not attempt to provide them. Instead, it presents them in a way that invites reflection, that encourages a deeper consideration of the complexities involved. As the narrative reaches its final moments, there is a sense not of closure, but of continuation. The events that took place in Honolulu continue to resonate, not because they are unresolved in a procedural sense, but because they remain unresolved in meaning. The image that lingers is not one of finality, but of tension. A story that begins with an accusation and ends with a death, yet leaves both suspended in uncertainty. A legal process that functions according to its rules, yet produces outcomes that are interpreted in different ways. A society that seeks justice, yet finds itself divided over what that justice should look like. In this tension, the case finds its lasting presence. It does not fade into the background as a resolved matter. Instead, it remains active, a point of reference for discussions about law, power, and the limits of certainty. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of all. Not the specific details, not the individuals involved, but the realization that some cases do not conclude in a way that satisfies the need for resolution. They remain open, not because they have been neglected, but because they reflect the complexities of the world in which they occur. In that sense, the Massey case is not simply a story from the past. It is an ongoing inquiry, a reminder that the search for truth and justice is not always straightforward, and that the answers we seek are sometimes shaped as much by what we believe as by what we can prove.